very quiet, and she's researching into why she is, and she thinks it's my fault, which is always mothers. I don't always say, she realizes, she has two children on that.
Yeah, today is May the 4th. Other than the May the 4th be with you, I have no idea why, what the tie-in with Star Wars is. I'm curious, and it was on this date in 1521 that Martin Luther, traveling back from the Diet of Worms, or the Diet of Worms, I guess if you're German, was captured and taken to the castle of Wartburg. Okay, so, for the longest time that was like, oh my, what happened to Martin Luther? But this was all sort of staged. He knew it was coming, and he was in protective custody, so to speak, in the castle of Wartburg, and that is where he translated the Bible into German, into the vernacular, the local language, which was not a normal thing at that time. There were some attempts at that previous to him, but his was the first very successful translation into the local language kind of thing. And he really, there are stories about his translation that, he was looking for a word. There's one story about he was looking for a word for sausage, that there was some word he wanted to translate as sausage, and he had the idea of what it meant in Hebrew, and he literally went to a butcher and he said, okay, how would you describe this? And that was the word he used to translate it into German, I should say. Martin Luther is also probably the last great Bible scholar that really questioned the canon. People nowadays, we like, there's 66 books in the Bible, 27 New Testament, 39 Old Testament. He was probably the last person. He didn't like James, he didn't like Revelation, and there's a couple of other books. And in his book, his New Testament, if you ever see his New Testament, it's in a different order, because he didn't like, the 4 books he didn't like, he put at the end. One of them is Revelation, so it's no big deal, but the other, like James, is at the end. It's like James Revelation, kind of like. But he was there for a while, long enough, like I said, to translate the Bible. In 1535, this is sort of a Reformation-related thing. In 1535, 5 priests were hanged, drawn, and quartered in England by Henry VIII for not submitting to Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. It was kind of interesting. This is once again another where this is ostensibly a Protestant church, killing people who didn't agree with them. So, always get a kick out of those stories myself. It's me. In 1856, the Mount Vernon Church in Boston reluctantly agreed to let Dwight Moody join their church. There was some question about whether he was truly converted. They said, all right, we'll let him in. Keep an eye on him, because always never know what's going to happen with somebody like that. And obviously he went on to great things, Moody Bible Institute, and et cetera. So that was in 1856 that he first joined the church. In 1904, the U.S. began construction of the Panama Canal, which has recently come back into the news. It was the longest time before I realized that if you've never, again, I'm teaching geography now, so this stuff is interesting to me. That the Panama Canal is a series of locks. We all live by locks. We don't know how locks are, but it literally picks the ships up and then brings them back down again. I always think of a canal as like there's a body of water over here and a body of water over here that are the same height, and then there's a hill behind you. Just kind of dig it, and then the water just flows through. It kind of that's how I figured a canal was. And no, it's like it literally has it's locks that picks it up over the sea level and then back down again. So it's kind of a interesting thing. Currently, it's in control of Panama. See how long that lasts. But That's that. And then finally in 1970, it was on this date that the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of church property being tax exempt. Okay, so from that point on, it was kind of an accepted rule, and then the Supreme Court kind of agreed with it. So that's all I got for today, May 4th. But again, we all have to go home and watch Star Wars today. That's your assignment. All right, so I tried. There's how many have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? Okay, so I mean, I tried in so many ways to come up with something that would really reminisce with the return of the Ark and all that. And returning the Lost Ark was as close as I could come, which isn't really close because it wasn't lost. They knew where it was. But be that as it may, it's how far I will go for a cute title. So today we're going to be talking about the return of the Ark. Now somebody will come up to me afterwards with the perfect thing I should have done. But if you remember back in previously in 1 Samuel chapter 7, the Ark of the Covenant, if you remember the Ark during the days of Samuel, they were fighting the Philistines and they weren't winning, and the leaders of the Israelite armies thought, hey, let's get our Ark up here. Let's bring the Ark of the Covenant up here. And so they brought the Ark of the Covenant up. There's a huge cheer in the land amongst the fighters. And, oh, great, our God is here, because they equated God's presence with the Ark, or God's approval, and somehow it was going to be better if the Ark was there. There was such a huge noise was made that the Philistine army heard it, and the Philistine army was reacting. And so you have this thought, there's this discussion going on in the Philistine army, which is the only time you see that in Samuel. And the Philistine army is like, oh man, we really need to fight hard, or we're going to be subject to the Ark. And so they did, and they beat the Israelites again, and the Ark was chosen. Our Ark was stolen, taken, captured. If you remember, Eli's 2 sons were killed in the process, and then there's the child was born, and the glory Ichabod, the glory is departed, etc., etc. So the Ark is with the Philistines for about 6 months. It's put into the temple, and the god Dagon falls on his face, and then it falls with its hands cut off. And so finally the Philistines say, listen, we need to get rid of this thing. So they send it back to the Israelites, and it's being led by 2 cows, lowing as they go. Again, somewhere in my life I heard a sermon that focused on the fact that the cows were lowing as they go, and I've never forgotten that. The weird things you remember. So, like here in this class here, you guys may not remember a single thing I said about Samuel, but you will remember that we had a mouse in our basement. Be that as it may. So the Ark was returned and was kept at a house, stored in the house of Abinadab, right? Abinadab? Oh, there's one other problem. Because Betsy printed these, I didn't have one to fill out. So we're going to be filling this out together today, and you know how that goes sometimes. Is it Abinadab? How many?
It is.
Yeah, Abinadab for 20 years. Okay, I should fill this out. Here we go. Abinadab for 20 years. So, looking at 2 Samuel chapter 5, beginning with, we'll start with verse 4. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. And we talked about this last year, but now at this point, David is solely the king of all of Israel, and now he needs to start centralizing things, okay? Whereas before he had a capital in Hebron, now he moves everything to another city. And let's talk about that beginning with verse 6. The king, that would be David, and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and lame can ward you off. They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. Okay, so basically, David and his men proceed to take over the city of Jerusalem. Okay, why? Why Jerusalem? What's the big deal about about Jerusalem? Well, for one thing, it's a centralized city. It's more central than Hebron was to Jerusalem. Okay, it's closer to. How many of you have been to Jerusalem? I've been there. Okay, it's more central than southern Judah was. Okay, and that's usually a good thing to have your capital in the center of your country. Usually, and most of the time, not always, but most of the time. Again, I'm teaching geography now. Most of the time, your capitals are in the center. Now, obviously, Washington, D.C. isn't the center of the United States now, but it was back in 1780, whenever they moved it there. Okay, so and that was part of the reason they moved it there, was they thought, well, you know what, we can be the central. It can be the central part of the nation. So it's a more centralized city. Another idea, and this is just speculation, is its city is filled with Jebusites. Okay, filled with Jebusites. This is a people group, and an interesting thing about them, if we look back in Exodus 33:2, Exodus 33, verse 2 says, then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place. Verse 2, I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Okay, so these are to be driven out. And then you move on to Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20, beginning with verse 17. However, in the cities of the nations of the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So for whatever reason, this is one of the people groups that the Lord had said you need to get rid of, you need to eliminate, you need to move out. Now, without getting into all of that ramifications of that, this were a people group that had come under the judgment of God. And so perhaps it could be seen as David's first military action is carrying out one of the Torah commandments. One of the, okay, I'm going to get rid of the Jebusites. Okay, so again, this is possible. He certainly was doing that in taking over Jerusalem and getting rid of the Jebusites. Whether that was his driving force or not, we really don't know. But he meets up with a Jebusite ahead of time, and the Jebusites gives him this very strange description about the blind and the lame, where he says, you can't get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. Okay. Now, this is an interesting statement that he makes, not because it's interesting in and of itself, but it kind of gets into the nature of biblical translation. Okay, so basically, nobody really knows what the Jebusites are saying to them. All they know is it has something to do with the blind and the lame. And depending on what translation you use, you may have a completely different idea, as far as what that phrase means. Okay? So in the world of biblical translation, you have what's, in terms of translating from one language to another, you have, like at one end of the spectrum, you have what's called like a formal equivalence, which is where you give exactly what the words are. This is just exactly what it is. On the other side, you have what's called a dynamic equivalence. Okay, this is in terms of translation. And then when you get in like paraphrase, then you're over on this side, okay? A dynamic equivalent is where you look at what the words are, the literal words are, and you say, okay, how would I express that idea in the language I'm writing in? So when Luther goes and says, I have a certain type of meat, I need to know the current word for this kind of meat. He could have given a definite translation of it, but it wouldn't have been exact. And so he's like, I want to know what the modern word is for this. Okay, that would be like a dynamic equivalent translation. And depending on what translation of the Bible you have, it usually tends toward one or the other. Okay, so the NIV, which is what I use, is a dynamic equivalent translation. Okay, they focus on understanding the meaning of the original language and then trying to phrase it in a certain way that would make sense to a contemporary reader. Okay, a contemporary example is again, if you speak Spanish and you say I like ice cream, you would say me gusta helado, right? Okay, me gusta helado, right? Everybody understanding Spanish, and if you were to literally translate that, Okay, literally just take the exact word, you would say, me is pleased by ice cream. Okay, but we don't walk around, if you're in English, you don't say, ice cream, me pleased by ice cream. I know, some of you may. Okay, you would say, I like ice cream. Okay, so that would be a dynamic equivalent. And if you take Spanish, they'll say, this is how it is in Spanish, but in English you would translate it because we just kind of invert the word order. Okay, and that's fine, and that's kind of the same idea. But there are Bible translations that if they were translating from the Spanish to English, they would translate me gusta helado to me is pleased by, or I am pleased by ice cream. Okay, so that would be a functional equivalent, and I believe like the ESV tends toward that. The New American Standard tends toward that. I believe the King James actually tends toward that as well. Okay, but the NIV is a formal equivalent. And again, when you get into like paraphrases, which is like the Living Bible, or the Message, you're a step beyond. Okay, you're just taking the modern and say, okay, how would I really translate that? Okay, and so in this particular text, you have this word about the blind and the lame, and they're looking at it as a translator. The literal translation makes no sense. Okay, it's or little sense. And so they say, well, let's see. David is attacking the city, and the Jebusites are there. What could they possibly be saying? Because it is a raised city, so maybe it's impregnable. So whoever translated this portion of the NIV decided that, well, that has to be a warning to David coming in that this is so impregnable that even the blind and the lame could hold you off. Okay. Other ways to look at it, some others have suggested it's like, well, be careful because there's a lot of blind and lame people in there, and don't hurt them. Okay, so all we know is that the Jebusites, before he attacks, says something to David about the blind and the lame. It uses Hebrew words to describe it, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so you're getting this third hand, that they're giving you, they use Hebrew words that aren't used anywhere else. So there's nothing we can compare it to and say, okay, this Hebrew word only appears here. There's no other source anywhere that uses this Hebrew word. Yes?
So was there any language difficulties between the Jebusites and the Israelites?
Meaning, like, did they speak?
Did they speak Hebrew? Jebusites?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, it's a good question, but I don't know. So regardless, David is going after. So again, that's just a free little bit about Bible translations and things like that. But it does get to another point about Bible translations, is that even if you are looking at, you say, okay, well, I want just the text. I just want to read what the text says. I don't want anyone's opinion. I just want to read the text itself. Okay, when you are reading just the text in any language other than the original, and you really want to split hairs, the original manuscript, you are reading somebody's opinion of it. Okay, when we were in Greece, we had a Greek tour guide, and she was a very wonderful woman, very much Greek Orthodox. She knew her stuff. Let me just say that. And she just made one really funny comment, which to the Americans in the group was funny. But she was talking about Bibles. And she said, when we Greeks talk about reading the Bible, we don't worry about versions. We just read the Greek, And I wanted to say, yeah, well, you read modern Greek and it's ancient Greek, but she was not the kind of person that you wanted to cross. Okay? She would have led us down a dark hallway and left us there, kind of thing. So I didn't. But it was. So yeah, even when you're looking at a translation, you're looking at, a lot of times you are looking at someone's opinion. So there is a translator somewhere who, you can figure out who it is. Their names are in the front of the Bible, and you can try and figure out. But there was a person or a group of people that looked at that and said, "What's the most likely thing this means?" And they said, "This is what it is. It's a boast on the part of the Jebusites that this is so impregnable, you're not going to get in there. Even the blind and the lame could hold you down," kind of thing. So it says, and there's more than that, because it says, on that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. Okay, so the word water shaft, nobody knows what that word is. Okay, water shaft. And even, again, this is, another, it says use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. Okay, so it's hard to picture King David as identifying the blind and the lame as being his enemies. And if you have an NIV, you'll see an NIV translator note that says, or are hated by David. Okay, so it's like, it's hard to picture that this is what David's like, oh, the blind and the lame, I hate them so much. And it's like, that's not really the David we kind of think about, especially when he's on his game kind of thing. It's just a really weird passage. He says, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and the lame will not enter the palace. Okay. Again, what is it about the blind and the lame here? We don't really know. So David then took up residences in the fortress and called it the city of David. So let me go back to this question of the water shaft. So what we know from archaeology and architecture and just studying that there was a water shaft, that led into the city of Jerusalem. And so the word itself is close enough to that, and they figure, well, what must have happened is they must have gotten into this water shaft, this water tunnel, and gone up into, and that's how they got into the city of Jerusalem at the time. Okay, so the exact details we don't really know, but again, we know there is a water shaft. I know there is a water shaft. I've been in it. Okay, have any of you done that? It starts in the city of Jerusalem, and it's mentioned later in the Bible. Hezekiah worked on it and created it so that it changed it a bit and made it reach a water source, so that the city of Jerusalem could survive the siege. They could just go through this shaft, this tunnel, down to a water source, bring the water back up, kind of thing. And it's a thing, and there's an opening, and you buy a ticket, and you go down, and you walk through this thing, and you come out in what's called the Old City, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's what's City of David.
Yeah, so it's what is now called the City of David, kind of thing. So they assume, based on the archaeology of Jerusalem, the fact that David was able to get in there, that they came through this particular watershed. But actually, we don't exactly know how it was he took over the city. Okay, but this was maybe the original readers would have known exactly what they were talking about. All we know is that he did. He accomplished it, because it says here, David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. Okay. Let's see. The references to the blind and the lame are confusing at best. Okay, so again, if I'm not perfectly clear, it's because the text isn't perfectly clear. All we know is David said, I want to take over Jerusalem, and when the dust settles, David is in Jerusalem. Okay, and that has become his capital, and it now starts referring to it as the city of David. Okay. David then took a residence. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Okay. Now we talked last week about pericopes and structures, and some look at this as the end. This verse 10. This is the end of David's rise to power. And really, at this point, David is at his peak, and he's going to be operating on all 8 cylinders, or all 4 horses, however they measured it back in the day. Okay, he's operating at peak efficiency right now. Okay, why? Because the Lord God Almighty is with him. Okay, spoiler alert: this isn't going to last. Just tell me. Okay, this isn't going to last. Verse 11. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David, along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Okay. Hiram's recognition of David here confirms to David that he is anointed as king. Okay, so Hiram is a foreign king. He's a foreign power. Okay, so by this gift that Hiram gives him recognizes David as the legitimate ruler. Okay, and I mean this is still a thing that happens today, that a country declares its independence, and then you kind of wait for somebody to recognize you, for another country to recognize you. Okay, so as I recall the story, this is just coming into my head, that at the time of the building of the Panama Canal, Panama was a part of Colombia. I believe this is correct. Could be wrong, but I believe it's the Panama was a part of Colombia. But the United States didn't really want to deal with Colombia. So they went in there and they said, the United States, let me tell you, the United States has been screwing around in Central and South America for a long time. Okay, I mean, there's a, you know, maybe not so much Mexico, but everything south of Mexico. I mean, we invaded Honduras at one point because we needed a more banana-friendly ruler there. Okay, and they wanted to send the Marines in and fix Central American countries and South American countries and all that. And there are stories of rulers that suddenly disappeared, and the United States is kind of thing. So the United States came in and says, you know what? Wouldn't it be great if this little area that we're going to work on declared its independence? And so they got an independence group, or met up with an independence group, and they declared their independence from this point on. And the United States immediately recognized them as being the legitimate ruler of Panama. So now the United States didn't have to deal with Colombia anymore. They could just deal with Panama. Okay, so it was this whole idea of recognition. It's going the opposite direction right now with Taiwan. It's fewer and fewer countries. They take back their recognition because China has said you can't recognize both China and Taiwan because China's so big, and China comes walking in with a wheelbarrow full of money, and a Chinese wheelbarrow full of money, which is a really, really big wheelbarrow full of money, and they say, you know what, if you stop recognizing Taiwan and recognize China, we'll just pour all of this money on you. And a lot of them do. So now it's a situation where there's only like a dozen countries in the world that recognize Taiwan. Okay, so again, this whole idea of recognition of a country, this is what Hiram is doing. Okay, and when Hiram shows up, says, oh, King David, it's like, okay, I'm the king. I have made it, kind of thing. So Hiram's recognition of David confirms to David his anointing as king. Okay, in verse, let's see, after he left, I don't have anything in the handout about this, but in verse 13, after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and many more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there. Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Okay, again, David's a busy guy. Okay, but you know what? This is what Samuel said was going to happen. Okay, so Samuel, if you go back and look at 1 Samuel 8, when the people said they want a king, okay, and Samuel said, this is what a king is going to do. Okay, there was no exception. There wasn't like, well, this is what a bad king is going to do, but a good king isn't going to do this. Samuel said, this is what a king is going to do. And that's exactly what David is doing. I'm collecting wives, I'm collecting concubines, I've got, and he gets used to this. Now what's interesting here is that Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon are all children of Bathsheba. I know what you're thinking. Who's Bathsheba? Stick around. We'll find out. She's coming up, kind of.
She's the Queen of Sheba.
Pardon me?
She's the Queen of Sheba.
Well, something like that. So again, this is just pointing out that David is doing what kings do. He has a harem. He's got what kind of came to be known as a harem. He's got a collection of wives. He's got a collection of concubines. He's got a collection of sons. I mean, at one point, I think later on we're going to find that he's got 20, ends up with 20 sons, which is a lot of sons. I'm just saying. I mean, it's just my opinion, but 20 is a lot, kind of thing. That's a lot of sons. So verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel. Now, this is kind of interesting because, not too long ago, David was their ace ally. David was living in their territory. David was upset because he wasn't allowed to fight for the Philistine king. Okay, now suddenly it's like, whoa, wait a minute. This is almost like that stereotypical situation where, somebody, anybody read Pride and Prejudice? Any fans of Pride and Prejudice? Okay, I love Pride and Prejudice. That's like one of the greatest novels ever written. But there's a scene in Pride and Prejudice where a guy comes in and proposes to Elizabeth Bennet. Okay, and it's this whole funny, and she refuses him, and he goes on and on about it's her, there's some distant relative kind of thing, right? And so this is the first time that Elizabeth refuses to marry somebody in the book. So he walks off, and then there's tempest in the house, and all of a sudden you discover that, like in the next chapter, he's proposing and is engaged to this girl's best friend. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute, and everybody's upset because it's like, well, wait a minute, you rejected him, right? And all that, and it's an interesting story. But suddenly you've got this, wait a minute, I thought you were my friend, but now you're not my friend, and it's like, I rejected him because he's a nitwit, but now you're going to marry him. So there's this whole, wait, what happened? So I think that the Philistines are kind of like the Bennett family, like, hey, what happened? Why is Mr. Collins suddenly going to marry Charlotte? Kind of thing. So if you know Pride and Prejudice, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but go with me on this, it works. Okay? So, they're like, wait, what happened? Now they realize, okay, I can see Achish, having a meeting. Achish was the king of the Philistines, sitting around with his advisors going, I think David may not have been the friend we thought he was. Really? Let's take a vote on that. How many think? So the Philistines come after him, and they say in verse 17, in full force. They went up in full force to search for him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Okay? So this could be like in Jerusalem now, you have like the city, and then you have the area they call the city of David, which is like the old city, or maybe this was a fortress area, or there's some fortress area within Jerusalem, and David hears that the Philistines are mad. Surprise. And so David says, okay, I'm going to go down into the city there, into the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands? So David, first of all, first thing he does, once again, the Philistines muster army, and again, David inquires of the Lord. Now, if you remember when David was in Ziklag, he's like, should I, David said, yeah, go. Now David is like, okay. It seems an obvious question, and I guess there's a lesson there. It seems an obvious, you're the king of Israel, and the Philistines are there to attack. Well, what does a king do? A king, leads in battle, and that's one of the things. And they're like, well, what should I do? Even though it seems obvious, David says, well, should I inquire, should I go up against these guys? And the Lord says, yes. The Lord answered, go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hand. Okay. So David again inquires of the Lord. Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines in your hand. So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, as waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So that place was called Baal Perazim, okay, which means the Lord who breaks out. Okay, so it's kind of like, we've all seen pictures of dams breaking, kind of flood walls breaking, and the water just coming out. That's how David is picturing this that he is, the Lord through him is just kind of breaking out against the Philistines. Okay. David's victory is so, let me read on a little bit here. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Okay, so David's victory is so great that the Philistines abandoned their idols there, which is kind of an interesting picture. Because if you remember, going back to our story in 1 Samuel 4, that the presence of these religious items was seen by both sides, that's why they brought the ark, seen by both sides as being the source of their strength. We are going to win because our God is here. Because then they had, Israel had the ark and the Philistines had their idols, kind of thing. In both of those situations, neither one of them worked. Okay, so the Philistines are like, okay, I got a choice here. I can carry this idol with me, or I can run for my life. So, given a choice, let's see. I'm going to just run for my life. Let's let the idol take care of itself. Really, if it is God, it's kind of like, think about the story about Elijah on Mount Carmel, and it's like, well, I said, God, why don't you just, but the God can take care of himself. I'm going to get out of here, sort of thing. So they abandoned their idols, and the Israelites carried them off. Now, a good question is, what did they do with them? I don't know. Okay, I don't know. But again, one of the things you know about Israelite history through the rest of their time period is they had this problem with idolatry. Where do they keep coming up with these idols? I don't know. Maybe they're in a warehouse along with the Ark of the Covenant. The next movie is going to be, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Dagon or something. I don't know. But maybe they're there and they go get them. Hey, let's go try this idol. Let's bring it out. Hiding or something. I don't know. Maybe they melted them down. We don't really know what they did with them. We just know that they carried them off. Okay. Just like the Philistines carried off the ark. Now the Israelites are carrying off the Philistine gods. And I'm sure that symbolism or repetition or whatever you want to call it was noticed by the Philistines. Once more, the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Okay, so apparently they didn't get enough, or they want to get their idols back. Okay, now this is some time later. Okay, we don't know how long, but there's some period of time. So David inquired of the Lord. Same thing. Again, it seems obvious, right? Go out and fight them. Okay, but this is similar to, if you remember the story of the Israelites coming into Jerusalem or into Israel. Okay, that they came over and they had this tremendous victory in Jericho. Okay, and then they said, okay, well now we have to go take over this small city of Ai. And they thought, well, you can just go take it. So you have this great victory, and the big lesson from Joshua and Ai and all of that is that don't take these victories for granted. You had a victory here, doesn't necessarily assume you're going to have a victory there. And so David doesn't make that mistake. He says, you know what, I know it seems obvious. I've got the strong position, I've got the momentum, I've got their idols, I've got every reason to just go out there and get them. But David again, David is firing on all 8 cylinders here. Okay, David inquires of the Lord again. Okay. Once again, the Philistines muster an army. Should be an army, not an army. And again, David inquires of the Lord. But this time the Lord provides a slightly different strategy. And he answered, do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar tree. So apparently there's, trees in the back. And it says, kind of sneak around behind them and come at them. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, march quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Okay, so this time the Lord provides a different strategy, and if you see, the strategy is that the Lord is in front. Okay, so it's kind of, I think there's another lesson there. I don't want to overly spiritualize the text. Actually, I don't want to spiritualize the text at all. But there is a lesson there. It's like, is our lead, is our idea to follow the Lord, or to, come on, Lord, catch up, How many of us do that, right? Don't worry, the Lord's going to come around to my way of thinking eventually. I know if I do this long enough. And David's like, all right, what do you want me to do? And so why did David win? Because the Lord was in front. Okay, and you'll see that reference a few more times in Samuel, where it says the Lord is in front. The Lord is the one fighting the battle. Okay. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Once again, David is completely victorious. Chapter 6. Any questions up to this point? So, for the time being, David has kind of eliminated the whole Philistine threat for the time being. Okay, and again, David is in Jerusalem. He wants to kind of centralize things. So the next thing he needs to do is he needs to bring the ark to Israel or to Jerusalem. Okay, he needs to bring the ark back to where it belongs. It says, David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. Okay, so David collects 30,000 able young men to go get it. Now, there's two interesting things about this. First of all, David knows, or the writer knows, exactly how many people were there. Okay, they apparently counted them. Now, just hold that thought. It's going to come back at the end of Samuel. Okay, but the other thing is, why 30,000? Why 30,000? We don't know. It doesn't say in the text. However, it is interesting to note that when the ark was lost, in the battle that the ark was lost at, the Israelites lost 30,000 men. Is it just coincidence, perhaps? Or was it, listen, I'm going to send one able young man to carry the ark back to represent each one that was lost before? Okay, nice. It's symbolic. Could be. Maybe it's just coincidence. Okay. So the name of the Lord, who is enthroned between the cherubim of the ark, he makes it clear. Okay, so all this description is to make sure we're all clear what ark we're going to get. I don't know how many there were, but we're clear which one we're going to go get. Okay. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Okay. David collects 30,000. They use a new cart. Now, if you go back to 1 Samuel 6, when the Philistines bring the ark back to Israel, they put it on a new cart as well. Okay, they bring in a new cart, and two guys. They set the ark of God, and Uzzah and Ahio, who are sons of Abinadab, which is the guy who owns owns the house that the ark has been sitting at for 20 years. To guard it. We're guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. So Ahio, you want to say Ohio, but Ahio, the one son is in the front. Apparently Abinadab is in the back. Okay, so they're walking behind this new cart. Now here's the problem. If you don't already know the problem. Okay, if you go back to Exodus 25 and Numbers chapter 7, I won't bore you with those details, but the clear description, and we mentioned this in 1 Samuel 4, was that the only way the ark was supposed to be moved was to be carried by hand. It wasn't supposed to be put on an ark on a cart in the first place. Mm-hmm. Okay, and we pointed out that was a mistake that the Philistines made, but you can kind of forgive the Philistines because what do they know, right? We just need this thing to get out of here. Okay, and they were just making sure there's going to be we're not going to put this in a used cart that might break. We're going to put it in a new cart so we know it's going to get out of our sight. Okay. David should have known better. Okay, he had Abishai. I think that was the name of the Asahel. No, Abishai was the priest that he had with him. Should have known. Hey, listen, if you're going to go get it, you got 30,000 men. I mean, come on, find 4 of them to carry the thing. Okay, but he doesn't. He gets a new cart. So what happens? They set the ark with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. So David is making a really, really big deal out of this, and rightly so. Okay, David wants everyone to know, hey, I'm bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. He wants everyone to know that. Okay, so he's got 30,000 men. He's got himself, he's got his priests, he's got all Israel lining the streets, kind of, cheering it on, sort of stuff. Hey, look, we're bringing back the ark. This is a great time, play music, the whole 9 yards. Okay, this is kind of like, actually, this is the plan for today's service. We're going to have, Pastor Jarrett will be coming up and Yeah, I'm just kidding. Just wait for the announcement, you'll find out. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. Okay. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Okay, so again, we know from the Torah that you weren't supposed to touch the ark. When they built the ark, they put like rings on the outside of it. And so you just used the pole, and the pole went through the rings, and you picked up the poles, and you picked up the ark. So you never had to touch the ark. You were not supposed to touch the ark. Now, you know, to a certain extent, I don't know whether to sympathize or not with Uzzah. I mean, the guy has been in the presence of the ark for 20 years. You'd think that if he'd been there for 20 years, you'd at least read up on how you were supposed to handle it. Okay? And you would have known that if you know, you've got this big thing, you know, I mean, you can imagine if you bought a house and you opened the garage of your house and you had, you know, a 1964 Aston Martin in the garage, that you would at least look up, what do I need to know about a 1964 Aston Martin? Or would you just put an ad on Craigslist or just give it on the buy nothing or free here, old car? No, we'd look up and say, oh, what's an Aston 64 Aston Martin? What's it worth? What do we do with it? Does it run? Can I make it run? You would find out about it, right? It just kind of makes sense. Well, so whatever, he doesn't. So he's standing behind something that he should have known wasn't the right way to carry the ark. He's behind the ark, looking at the ark, and if he's looking at the ark, he can probably see the hoops through which the poles are supposed to go to carry the ark, right? So, I mean, you know, at some point he goes, yeah, I wonder what those poles are for, you know. But he doesn't. The ark stumbles. He sees the ark, and again, he's just like protecting. Hey, I've got 20 years into this thing, so he reaches out to grab the ark. Now, we kind of get the idea here that the Lord is not happy with this whole procession. But if you're going to do it right, right? Why not? You know, but they don't, and so it says, the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Another way to translate it is his negligence. His negligence. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Boy, that's a way to really take the wind out of this celebration. You know, I don't know how it looked. I don't know whether lightning struck him or he suddenly touched it and all of a sudden, you know, whatever. But all of a sudden, having one of the guys drop dead right there, that's a great way to bring an end to a celebration. Okay? And that's what happens. And it says, David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. And to this day, that place is called Perez Uzzah, which means outbreak against Uzzah. Or like, this is the place that Uzzah died. Okay, so David is angry. Like, why is David angry? Is he angry at God? Is he angry at Uzzah? Is he angry at himself? It could be any one of those. It could be all three of those. We don't know, okay? So David was afraid of the Lord that day. Was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of God ever come to me? David realized that his plan is not working here. Now, in hindsight, we notice that we don't see David inquiring of the Lord whether he should bring the ark back. You know, we see him inquiring of the Lord whether he should go to Philistines. We don't see David inquiring of the Lord whether he should bring the ark back. Maybe he just thought this was such an obviously good idea that God knows it. Okay. He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Okay, that's as far as I'm going to go today, because we're going to leave the ark in the house of Obed-Edom. Whatever is going to happen, will the ark ever get back? We don't know. Tune in next week. Any questions? Anybody want to say some interesting things? Again, this is David. You know, David. This is David at his peak. This is David the king at his peak. This is the best. To a certain extent, this is the best that the kingdom is going to be. All right, well, thank you very much for coming. See you again next week. Yeah, next week is May 11th. We'll celebrate another movie. Well, May the 11th week. Doesn't work, but we'll try. All right, thank you very much. Okay, rush out of here real quick. That's